Welcome back. You're watching Gravitas. The Supreme Court in India was in the thick of action again. And another issue, the BCCI versus Lodha Commission tug of war. As a consequence, the BCCI top brass are out. The Supreme Court today formally sacked the two administrators, Anurag Thakur and Ajay Shirke, paving the way for a new interim administration. Now, it has been a challenge, the fight of the administration against the judgments of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has threatened the administrators again and again that if they do not follow suit, they do not take the recommendations of the Lodha Commission, the BCCI will have to face tough action. It had once even threatened the BCCI president with a jail term. So it's certainly one of those challenges the BCCI has faced. Now we have to remember, these are all administrations with a tremendous amount of money with them. The BCCI total budget and runs into thousands of crores, their turnover annually. If you look at all the sports combined in India, literally tens of thousands of crores. But the challenge has been that these administrations function on their own and they cannot be controlled. Sometimes players have complained the way these administrations function. The government has had no control, and there has been controversies and issues for the last many decades now. Finally, the Supreme Court has clamped down and it said change the cricket board, but this is just the start of how things are going to unfold. What they're hoping is that there will be administration change in all other sports bodies, which means elections need to be transparent, players need to be represented, and we have to make sure that the sports bodies succeed and the players succeed. Now, Aisha Sindhu has been covering sports for years. She joins me live. Aisha, tell me how large and how big this decision is.
You know, Rohit, you said it all already. This is a sport that is huge, not just in India, across the world. It is a sport in India that is full of power, full of money, and more importantly, unaudited money. And I think that is really at the crux of this tussle between the Lodha panel and the BCCI. The fact that, you know, the money that comes into the sport is not open for people to see how it is utilized. Now, this has obviously not gone down well with the Supreme Court, and it has gone and called what it terms today in that judgment the obstructionist policies of Mr. Thakur, Anurag Thakur and Ajay Shirke, and heads have rolled, so to speak.
Right.
But in terms of what this means for the sport, it means a lot. It means that, you know, the sport is not immune to legal intervention.
Aisha, hold on there. Joining us live is Mr. Harish Salve. Mr. Harish Salve, big decision here today. What kind of an impact is this decision going to have on sports in India?
Well, it's been waiting to happen. There was a decision given by the Supreme Court which, as you remember, emanated from serious allegations of match fixing which touched the office of the president of the BCCI. One would have hoped that any robust organization would auto-correct itself, but the way in which the BCCI sort of closed ranks to defend him and then the manner in which it is conducted made it obvious that the whole thing needed a redesigning. And that's what Supreme Court appointed a committee which heard all the stakeholders, came with recommendations, and finally asked them to set their house in order. They refused. So believe me, it's never the preferred option for a court to slam these decisions down people's throat. It's just that the Supreme Court reached a point where it almost, as it were, they were not willing to carry out the decision of the Supreme Court. So it had to give these binding directions.
Mr. Salve, this has been going on for decades. Sports bodies have never listened. Do you think this is the start of a brand new era in sports administration in India?
What you're raising is an important question linked to an evolution in the standards of governance which we have seen in the world, not just in our country, and B, in the jurisprudence of the country, which has to keep pace with the expectations of the people. Today, we have whether we like it or not, a much greater degree of transparency, even in the government. Elected governments today have to be transparent. All organizations which till yesterday said, these are our private affairs, don't ask questions, all have to be transparent. And the BCCI kept, I'm sorry, I've been a bit of a trenchant critic of this attitude of the BCCI, where it suited them. They were the national authority governing the life of cricket and cricketers. And where it suited them, they said, we are a small society under the Tamil Nadu Societies Registration Act. Why are you interfering in our working? You can't have both. So there was the growing jurisprudence world across has said that clubs, even clubs which have such far-reaching implications on the lives of people, have to follow norms of fairness. They had this coming. Now, sometimes we set our house in order. Sometimes we have to be asked to set our house in order.
Sure. Mr. Salve, last question to you. How is there a requirement of a law, a sports law? A lot of people have been asking about there needs to be an establishment. Do you think India is in that direction? Will it be able to establish a well-rounded law which will kind of dictate how these bodies exist, how they get formed, and how they continue going that direction?
I've for a long time been a votary of a law which would set up, as it were, the architecture in which sports bodies in India should work. It should ensure that they work democratically. It should ensure that there are provisions by way of checks and safeguards by which vested interests are not created. And it should ensure that the ultimate purpose of promoting the sport and promoting the sport not just in elitist fashion, but making facilities of the sport available to each Indian are best subserved, because that's how we will discover the best talent. And I think the time is now ripe, because what happens, let me tell you, what happens is whenever there is a Supreme Court verdict or a court-appointed committee, what you get is always at best an ad hoc solution. The job of making laws is that of Parliament, and ultimately they have to take this task upon themselves, recognize reality, and make an architecture under which not just the BCCI, but in which the Wrestling Federation, the Hockey Federation, the Football Federation, etc. work. I mean, isn't it last week that we were all somewhat red in our face over what happened to the Olympic Association?
Mr. Salve,
Right.
You've been a very big voice in democratizing sports bodies and making sure that they function properly. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to go back to Aisha, asking her, Aisha, there are a lot of supporters for cleaning up the whole act here for the sports bodies. Do you think India is now in that point where it can begin making those changes?
Well, absolutely, Rohit. I think what has happened today, as Mr. Salve was pointing out, the fact that the Supreme Court had to intervene goes to show how bad the situation was. And it also goes to show that the Supreme Court is not going to shy away from intervening when it feels that the functioning of a body, even if it is a club, even if it is a small body that is taking care of a small sport, that if it is not going right, they have every right to intervene. Now, we've seen what happened with the Indian Olympic Association recently. We've seen this tussle between the BCCI and the Lodha panel taking place, and it just goes to show that when necessary and when required, the Supreme Court has every right to step in, and it will with big decisions such as seeing off Mr. Anurag Thakur and Mr. Ajay Shirke.
Aisha, let's take a look at the timeline of this whole conflict. January 2015, court appoints Lodha committee to look into the functioning of BCCI and suggest changes to its constitution. On 4th February 2016, Supreme Court sets date for BCCI to make their stance on the Lodha committee. 19th February 2016, BCCI cites anomalies and difficulties in implementing recommendations. On 18 July 2016, the Supreme Court rules in favor of implementing most of Lodha committee's recommendations, and it gives BCCI 6 months to implement them. On 21st September 2016, the BCCI defies one part of the Lodha committee's order, picks a 5-member selection panel for the men's, women's, and junior teams. On 21st November 2016, the Lodha panel recommends that all BCCI office bearers not complying with the recommendations be removed from their post. On 15 December 2016, Supreme Court came down hard on BCCI President Anurag Thakur, saying that he appears to have prima facie committed perjury. On 2nd January 2017, the Supreme Court removes Anurag Thakur as the president of the BCCI in regards to charges of perjury and contempt of court. Joining me live and giving us a perspective on how this has unfolded and how politically, parties are involved in this, because every political party, when it comes to power, it deploys bureaucrats in the system who run these political bodies, and it's become a big, game for political parties, because these sports bodies are rich, they're powerful, and sports like cricket are religion in a country like India. Karthikeya, give me a little more sense on what kind of an impact it has on political parties itself.
I think the biggest impact, Rohit, it will have on the political parties is that the model sports bill is going to become a reality. That's number one, which means that every federation, including BCCI in time to come, will come on the right of the Information Act. Secondly, it will also go in a long way to improve the internal autonomy, internal structures of the sporting federations, whereby there will be an age limit, there will be a tenure limit, and most important of all, the financial functioning will be available to the civil society through the right of the Information Act. But I would say that the Supreme Court's intervention proves one thing, that it is often that the political legislative fails and the vacuum created by them to sort out the problems between the executive and legislature, that the judiciary comes in. This could have been solved, Rohit, with the help of the political executive, but it did not happen, and came the judicial intervention. And I think it's a classic case where what should have been solved by the politics has been done by the judges.
Sure. Aisha, could you tell me, could this situation have been entirely avoided? We could have been in a very different spot. Do you think the BCCI did not see this coming?
Rohit, it's so interesting you bring this up, because we've had so many voices weighing in on this tussle here on WION, and we've heard a variety of opinions come forward. And one of the consensus points has been that yes, this decision that has been taken today could have been avoided altogether had a conversation taken place between the top brass of the BCCI and the man who's really come up with these recommendations, who is Justice R.M. Lodha. Now, July 18th last year was when the Supreme Court went forth and said that these recommendations have to be abided by. It's taken 6 months for the BCCI to really go back and forth with the panel, saying this is not possible and that's not possible. If this ego tussle hadn't taken place, if Anurag Thakur had sat down with the justice and said, well, these are the recommendations we agree with, and these are the pain points for us, and this is what is causing difficulty in applying these recommendations, yes, definitely. I mean, in my opinion, I think this situation could have been avoided, where we would not have seen the country's top apex court coming in and literally having to take a decision like removing the head of a sports body.
Karthikeya, they started out as recommendations, but the writing on the wall was these were not recommendations. They had to be followed because the Supreme Court wanted it done. It realized that these sports bodies weren't functioning democratically and didn't represent a country like India. Do you think that in itself was missed by the BCCI?
Absolutely. If you would remember, Rohit, in 2010, there was a bill called the Model Sports Bill, which was introduced by Ajay. Then Jiten Singh, who is the sort of Maharaja of Alwar, went on to become the sports minister. When NDA came to power, it was Sarbanand Sonowal, who now happens to be the Chief Minister of Assam, and now Mr. Vijay Goyal, who happened to be the MOS PMO when Vajpayee was the Prime Minister in 2002, is now the sports minister. The actual problem is of the will, because BCCI went on to become an incestuous club of powerful politicians. Look at the people who were there. Jyotiraditta Scindia, his father Madhavrao Scindia. Then you had people like Lalu Prasad Yadav. Even Amit Shah went on to become the president. The issue is will there be a sports body which is independent of politicians? That's the larger question. And I think when the politicians fail, the courts got in. And I think that's the big signal from our judiciary, that let sports be managed by the people who do the sports, not those who are professional politicians. They can help, but they should not control it.
Aisha, this must be a welcome decision for many sports people who, have had abuse at the hands of bureaucrats and politicians running these sports bodies. You've spoken to many of them over the years. Explain to me, what kind of a reaction will they be having tonight?
Well, Rohit, like you're saying, many people have been done wrong. We've seen just last week with the Indian Olympic Association making those decisions about the live president posts. A lot of people came forward and said that they were almost offended by the choice of Mr. Kalmadi and Mr. Chautala. Just going to show really how a lot of people have been wrong by the way sports is run in this country. As Karthikeya was pointing out, vested interests, power, politics, these only go and complicate otherwise simple decisions as far as choices of athletes and administration and training goes. Of course, for those people, I'm sure this is a win-win today, seeing that there is a body out there that is looking at the way sport is being run in the country and ensuring that people are made to toe the line when necessary. And I think more importantly, what has happened today has not just affected cricket. It's going to snap a lot of sports bodies in this country out of lethargy and make them realize that they're not immune. When the Supreme Court needs to step in, it will.
Absolutely. And spoken to many sports people, some of them very senior leaders of the country today, and they always said, we don't know how these sports bodies are functioning. It's a challenge to be able to deal with them. Certainly, I think that message was heard loud and clear, and the court decision today is in line with what a lot of people have been asking for years. There have been tremendous amount of Indian movies that have been made about how some sports people have been wrong. Karthikeya, give me a little sense from your perspective. How and when do we see things changing in the next few months? What happens?
Okay. Rohit, my understanding is that the things will change only when there will be a parliamentary legislation on the model sports bill. What makes the model sports bill very different? And a lot of people ask that. What makes it different is that it allows the right of the Information Act to access the funds which the politicians are getting. Secondly, what it does is it helps the tenure to be settled in terms of age. Secondly, it fixes the number of the time you can contest the elections. And most important of all, it takes away sport from working politicians to the working sportsmen and sportswomen. And that's where the power of the bill lies. But unfortunately in India, the BCCI had become an incestuous club. If you look at the morphology of the BCCI, it's not about BJP or Congress. It's about everyone. Every chief minister in this country happens to represent the cricket board from his own state. Is it correct? No, it is not. Right. But it has been done.
We are now joined by Sanjay Hegde. He's a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. Mr. Hegde, your thoughts on the Supreme Court verdict. Will this help the BCCI become more accountable from now on?
It will definitely help the BCCI become more accountable. This is a logical culmination of a process which started a long time ago. You must remember that cricket came to the Supreme Court in the form of cricketers way back in the time of Mohammad Azharuddin, who had been dropped from the team. Ever since cricket disputes started coming into the Supreme Court started playing greater and greater roles in administration. Finally, in this particular BCCI case, this BCCI case comes as a spin-off of corruption in the IPL, or corruption allegations, where two factions who were fighting with each other used corruption allegations against each other, and then the Supreme Court had to come in with a clean-up. They had to send investigators in. after that, then the Supreme Court said, let's put everything on an even keel. Therefore, it appointed the Lodha committee consisting of a retired Supreme Court judge and 2 other judges to make recommendations as to how to put the constitution of the BCCI in place and thereafter run things on an even keel. The BCCI still did not get the message. It tried its best to drag its feet. It also tried reviews. It even tried to perjure itself. In fact, the Supreme Court today has issued perjury notices to the former president of the BCCI.
Mr. Hegde.
Ultimately, this is the action of a court whose authority was challenged continuously by the Lords of Cricket.
Mr. Hegde, do you think long term can judiciary be running all of these bodies in terms of shouldn't the government and the system be running these bodies on their own? Why should Supreme Court have to intervene? Isn't this a bit of a challenge on how our bodies function?
It definitely is a challenge, but it isn't as if the Supreme Court on its own bat went in and started playing. The Supreme Court was invited in. Who invited it in? It was a fight between Lalit Modi and Mr. Srinivasan, who were both members of the BCCI at one point of time, and their internal fights which had to come for adjudication to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court started cleaning up the mess could not be resolved without reconstituting in the entire structure of cricket. Obviously, this is a job that the government ought to have done by legislation, but the BCCI does not want legislation. Ultimately, there has to be some law even in the regulation of sports, and if you cannot trust private bodies to come to an adequate and fair law, the law has to step in, the courts have to step in.
It started out with corruption and allegations on each other, but it's now gotten down to getting into details of how administration, selection of committee members and all of that. I can't understand, bodies which literally their turnover runs into thousands of crores didn't understand that they had to run the system more democratically in a far more transparent manner. How has this continued to go on for the last many, many decades?
It has happened because the BCCI functioned as a closed club. You must remember historically it started with the Maharajas supporting cricket. Thereafter, a few corporate houses stepped in, and most importantly, politicians stepped in. The BCCI or cricket in India itself became a refuge and an alternate profession for politicians. The depoliticization of the game, the putting of the game on sound administrative and legal principles is essentially what the Lodha committee has been doing. It has made several recommendations, including the fact that people above 70 or people who have served on the BCCI for more than 9 years in any capacity should not be allowed to continue further. It has also kept politicians out of the game. This may to some minds look like judicial overreach or judicial legislation, but it is essentially the judiciary stepping into areas that needed a structure of governance where the government was not intervening, because obviously it was the politicians who controlled the game, and the politicians who also control the government, they wanted to keep this away. So finally it fell on the judiciary, and the judiciary has tried to come up with a structured response, to which the BCCI dragged its feet and in effect told the Supreme Court, come and get me. I don't think in a democratic country you can take on the top court like that.
Absolutely. Mr. Hegde, you talk about judicial overreach in some ways. And many would have turned around and said, but these are democratically elected bodies. But that democracy was not absolute in any way. These bodies, explain to us the structure of these bodies and how they were able to win elections in spite of structure was entirely based on you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Give us a sense of that body.
You see, essentially the BCCI is a club which is registered in the state of Tamil Nadu, and elections to it come from other clubs which conduct cricket all over India. Now, certain states had more than one entity, whereas some states went entirely unrepresented. For instance, you had the Bombay, Maharashtra and Vidarbha, which were three associations which all serviced the state of Maharashtra. Whereas the entire Northeast, there was hardly any cricket association. Now, unrepresentative structure nationwide went into elections which were basically almost predetermined, or in as much as presidentship went by rotation, and certain individuals knew that if they waited long enough, it would finally be their turn. It was that each association took the maximum that it could in terms of favors from the incoming administration, that okay, that they would be allotted a test match or a one-day match, or that so much of central funds would come from the BCCI and no questions would be asked about accounts and receipts. So it turned into a cozy club. The state of Bihar, the Bihar Cricket Association, was denied representation on the BCCI. It went to court, and then obviously we know that some people who had been thrown out of the IPL, like Mr. Modi, backed the Bihar Cricket Association to take its fight further, and that's how this entire judgment has come about.
Absolutely.
If you think that the court stepped into the mess, no. The court was dragged into the mess by the BCCI's infighting.
The little boys club, certainly the apple cart is now toppled. Thank you, Mr. Hegde, for joining us on this show. Also, thank you, Aisha and Karthike and Mr. Harish Salve for joining us for this show tonight. For more news and updates from all around the world, keep watching WION. Good night and good luck.